Let's take a look at the very early history of the British Isles. We're going to be talking about people called Celts and Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and Normans. I'll start off with the fact that all of those groups and many others belong to something called the Indo-European group. It's a language and cultural group which started somewhere here around about the area between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea there that you can see on the map. And about 5,000 years ago, there was a big migration to the west, and there had been also equally big migrations to the east, but we're interested in the west and particularly in Western Europe here. I'd like to focus on what's going on in this part of the picture. We've got several different groups of Indo-European peoples. It means that they're all sharing a language that has a common root, that their languages, although very different today, spring from a basic single root. And these people would include the Scandinavian people in the north, whom we will be meeting as Vikings. It would include the Celtic or Gaelic people who occupied the British Isles, the Germanic or Teutonic people who lived in the northern mainland area of Europe. It also includes the Latin or Roman people, the Hellenic Greek people, and the Iberian Celts, the Spanish people. We're interested, of course, in the British Isles. The Celtic or Gaelic people are of particular interest to us. The Germanic and Scandinavian Viking people will also be coming into our story. So before the Anglo-Saxons ever got to Britain, let's take a look and see at the makeup of the inhabitants. Now, before we begin, let's take a look at the geography, because the geography tells us a lot about which land was the best land and why people wanted certain land. We'll notice that the land in the south, basically the southern part and mostly to the eastern side of Britain, is low-lying, whereas there are mountains through most of Scotland, most of Wales. Ireland has some hilly, more kind of upland areas, but much of it is fairly flat or low-lying. But of course, it is stuck out there in the Atlantic, gets a lot of rain, and so that will also affect the pattern of colonization. Before the Anglo-Saxons arrived, we had the Brythonic or Brittonic Celts who were living in an area which is similar to England and Wales today, and these people are also known as the Ancient Britons. Of course, there were people in Britain before them, but we don't have much trace. I suppose we would know something about them through their prehistoric remains, but there's no written history of those people, and culturally they don't exist for us today as a distinct group, whereas the Celtic people, of course, do. So the first group then being the Brythonic or Brittonic Celts, also called the Ancient Britons. And further over in Ireland and Western Scotland, the Goidelic or Gaelic Celts, another group of Celtic people who arrived somewhat later than the Ancient Britons. And finally, up in the north of Scotland there, we have the Picts, who were probably Celtic, but there is some debate. Scholars are not so sure. We don't know all that much about the Picts. So these would be the people who were there, 2,000 years or so ago, and when the Romans arrived in 55 BC, this is what they found. So they mostly remained in the area that we would today call England and Wales, and so they mostly had contact with the ancient Britons, the Brythonic or Brittonic Celts. And when they left, some 450 years later, things were pretty similar to the way they were when they arrived. The same groups of people were living in roughly the same areas. The main differences would have been the Roman influence in terms of infrastructure. All right, Roman Britain occupying this kind of area here and making a difference in terms of infrastructure with roads and cities, London, the city of London, the wall at the northern limit of their control. They did build two because they extended their control a little bit further north into Scotland for a while, but Hadrian's Wall would be the main one, showing the cultural break, the cultural divide, more or less, between England and Scotland. The border today is a little bit different from Hadrian's Wall, but roughly speaking, this is where the two countries really get divided into very, very different cultural, social, linguistic entities. All right, so when the Romans leave, they leave things like this, as we've seen, with Picts in the north, Gaels in the west, and Britons in the remaining part of Britain. Now that the Romans have gone, the islands are left unprotected, open to attack from the east, from Europe. The Roman infrastructure is still there. In fact, some of it is still being used today. London is still the capital. Some of those roads are still being used as motorways or as other forms of highway. And into this area, which was now unprotected, we get people moving from Europe, basically from the area mostly that is now Germany, and pushing the Britons further to the west. These people, these new arrivals, are basically Anglo-Saxon, although there were also people called Jutes. So we have the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes coming from this area in Northern Europe. And slowly they start to take over the lands of the ancient Britons, leaving many of those who remained in a position of, well, almost slavery, while others would have moved out of the area under Saxon or Anglo-Saxon control, or even left Britain altogether, so that we end up with the beginnings of the country that we call England, that is Anglo land. And the Anglo-Saxon people are the origin of the English language, the English culture, the political entity of England. Arriving originally around about the middle of the 5th century, and within 100 years or so, they've established several different kingdoms, mainly 7 kingdoms across the southern half of Britain, pushing, as I say, the Britons into the western areas. And if we look at the geography, we'll see that they were occupying the greenest, the most fertile, the best agricultural land, whereas the Celtic people and the Britons and the Picts and Gaels had all been pushed into the less attractive areas, the mountainous areas in the western side of the country, or into the more remote area of Ireland. So there's quite a strong link, in a way, between the political colonization of Britain and its geography. So this area in the southern and more towards the east, this area is more highly prized, and this is the area that the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes settle in, and this is the beginnings of the country, England. Okay. I said there were seven Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the rest of the country, the Celtic areas, were also divided into smaller kingdoms, so that around about the beginning of the 8th century, it would have been divided into a number of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in this kind of way. We also notice up in the north of Scotland there an area in dark red, which is the Norwegian territories, and we can see in East Anglia, in the south east, north of the area north of London there, a white area along the coast, which is called the Danelaw, and this is the beginnings of a new arrival. These are the Vikings, who are coming from still further north, from Norway and from Denmark. And these people also have quite an important impact on the early development of England. They arrive in Anglo-Saxon England and, of course, in other parts of Britain and Ireland, and they establish control, especially in this northern and eastern part of England, what we now call England, where this area that was under Viking control was called the Danelaw. During the 9th and 10th centuries, this was when this Danelaw was at its height, and Viking control was strong in Britain. So we can see that at its broadest extent, more than half of what is now England was actually controlled by the Vikings. Then we get the Norman invasion, and basically the Saxon kingdoms by this time have united, partly to defend themselves against the Vikings, and they have their great hero Alfred the Great, who more or less saved Anglo-Saxon culture and Anglo-Saxon identity at a time when England was very much under threat from the Vikings. So although he did manage to protect the country from being completely under Viking control, the Vikings continued to have an important presence, and there were actually 3 Danish kings in the early part of the 11th century. Later on in the 11th century, there was a Saxon king, and in 1066 another Saxon king, King Harold, came onto the throne, and he was destined, I'm afraid, to be very unlucky. There was a Viking attack shortly after he was elected to the throne, or shortly after he became king, and there was a Viking attack in the north of England. So Harold had to go with his army and defeat them. But straight after that, there was another attack by people called Normans, who were actually also of Viking origin, but were living in France and speaking French. About 200 years earlier, they had moved into that area of northern France, which we still call Normandy, and they invaded England from the south. So Harold's army was by this time exhausted and was unable to fight them off. So we get, firstly, the army moving north to fight at Stamford Bridge, and they were successful against the Vikings on this September the 25th, 1066. However, the Norman attack in the south forced them to make another march. Looking at the scale, you can see it's about 300 kilometers, or maybe more. The total amount of distance covered by those soldiers was probably about 600 kilometers. Well, they were exhausted by the time they got to Hastings. Quite a lot of them had been killed at Stamford Bridge, even though the battle had been won. The weakened army was not able to resist the Normans. So 1066 is a key year for British history, for English history in particular, because this is when the Normans take control of the country until now occupied by the Anglo-Saxon people. The Battle of Hastings is the famous battle in which the king, the Saxon king Harold, is said to have lost his eye, although probably that's just a story. He was probably killed. He was killed in the battle, but he was probably killed by some other means. So, at any rate, now William the Conqueror, the Norman conqueror from France, is now in control in England. The Saxons become second-class citizens under Norman control. So just to sum up a little bit, we've found that there are several different ethnic, linguistic and cultural identities in the British Isles, even from fairly early days. It's not just one single culture. In particular, we should think about the Celtic identity and the Saxon identity. And there were also important connections between these different countries, cultures, ethnic identities. Christianity, for example, was spread to the Anglo-Saxon people partly from emissaries from Rome, but partly also through the influence of Celtic Christianity brought into Britain during the time of the Romans. So the contact was not always violent, and in fact, as we shall see, cultural contact, intermarriage, and things like that were just as important, really, in forming the United Kingdom, which was later to come into existence. And we need to think about the relationship between these different countries on several different levels, which is what we're going to do over the next few weeks, focusing on the early modern period. The next section, the next presentation that I'm going to make, is going to look at the later medieval period, so that we'll be ready to get started on our main focus, which is going to be the Tudor and Stuart periods of the 16th and 17th centuries.